The engines are barely whispering. Night of 11 to 12 December 1942, north coast of Guadalcanal, just off Cape Esperance. On the bridge of a Japanese destroyer, a staff officer checks his luminous watch, then the shoreline. Supplies in oil drums bob behind them, drifting toward hungry troops ashore. Off the bow, the sea is thick and black. Behind and to port, a shape streaks low, throwing a white rooster tail when it surges. Another appears. They're small, almost toy-like next to a 134-meter warship, but they carry torpedoes that can break a spine. Seconds later, two heavy jolts slam into the stern. Fire licks up wind. Sprays of oil rain down. The flagship staggers, rudder useless, men shouting in the smoke. Somewhere aft, a depth charge locker is growing hot. Nearby, those toys, PT-37 and PT-40, are already fading back into the dark. Throttles open, mufflers back on, wakes snuffed by wind and spray. The destroyer is Teruzuki. In a few hours, an explosion will finish her. A Japanese admiral will be carried off wounded, and every small U.S. plywood boat in the slot will hear the message in their headsets. Keep the pressure on. Keep the night unsafe. The night war around the Solomons had new predators. They were not pretty ships. 80 feet of laminated wood, 3 screaming gasoline engines, a deck cluttered with tubes or roll-off racks, cannons lashed to improvised mounts, extra ammo tins everywhere. They had thin hulls and thin margins, but they had speed, 40 knots when clean, and a mission: interdict whatever the Imperial Japanese Navy tried to move after dark. In the high arcs of searchlights and the slashes of tracer, a doctrine was being forged. Deny the enemy his logistics under cover of moon and cloud, and keep your own boats alive to do it again tomorrow night. What the Japanese believed would work in these waters: big destroyers sprinting down the slot on moonless nights, drums tossed to the current, then a dash home, collided with a system the Americans were still assembling in real time. Spirit versus system is the frame we'll use. On one side, superb night destroyer crews and the culture of audacious surface action. On the other, dozens of small boats networked by coast watchers, radio, radar, and a logistics machine that could feed the fight nightly. The thesis: by late 1943, PT boats didn't need to win set-piece duels to win the campaign. They needed to make Japanese captains fear the dark water. The math: number of patrols, number of barges turned back, number of hours Japanese supply, lines sat idle, would decide who ate on the beach and who didn't. The Solomons mattered because they were the hinge of the Allied. Drive to neutralize Rabaul and unhinge Japan's outer defense. After Henderson Field survived in 1942, every island to the northwest, New Georgia, Colombangara, Vella La Vella, Bougainville, became stepping stones. The Japanese could reinforce or evacuate only at night, and mostly by water. Every ton brought down the slot was a ton that could shoot back tomorrow. U.S. heavy forces were finite. A cruiser duel risked disaster. PT boats offered a different currency. Many small bets placed every night, close to land where destroyers were vulnerable, and too shallow for big ships to dance. In that calculus, hours mattered. If PTs forced a convoy to idle behind an island for 30 minutes to avoid an ambush, aircraft had that much more time at dawn to pounce. If PTs pushed destroyers to abandon drum runs in favor of barges hugging reefs, the U.S. was ready with barge killers, PTs themselves, strafing P-40s, and PBY Black Cats dropping flares. Japanese doctrine began with confidence. In mid-1942, their destroyer squadrons had superior night optics, long-range torpedoes, and hard-drilled bridge teams. The Tokyo Express premise was straightforward. Sprint down the slot under cover of weather and moon, unload or roll drums, then turn at high speed, constrained only by dawn and aircraft. If small craft appeared, smash them with gunfire. If larger U.S. forces tried to intercept, out-torpedo them. That logic worked often in 1942, but it assumed the Americans would play to the IJN's strengths. Fight at sea, in neat formations, at speeds where long lances ruled. What happens when the fight shifts to 200 yards off a jungle shoreline, where machine gun tracers rake barges tucked under palms, and every searchlight beam becomes a target? Japanese countermeasures, armored barges mounting 25-40 mi tracer, shore batteries along barge routes, float planes prowling for PT wakes, kept the PTs honest. Yet those measures acknowledged a changed game. Destroyers increasingly avoided confined waters where a single torpedo hit meant a long, fatal limp. The American design philosophy was brutally pragmatic. The boat was a platform for speed and modular firepower, not a miniature destroyer. Elco's 80-footers and Higgins's 78-footers carried 3 Packard V-12s, initially fund on 200 HP each, later pushed to 2,500, burning 100-octane gasoline. Engines swapped at 600 hours kept reliability up. Early boats used 21-inch Mark 8 torpedoes in tubes, heavy, with black powder or compressed air ejection. Their flashes could betray a boat in the act. By mid-1943, South Pacific PTs increasingly adopted lighter Mark 13 torpedoes on roll-off racks. Less weight, less deck clutter, faster salvo reactions, and a 600 LEB Torpex warhead. As the mission turned against barges, a stern 40 mm and Bofors, bow 20 mm 37 mm, and extra 50 cals became standard. 3 PTs, 59, 60, 61, were even converted into pure gunboats. Radios mattered as much as guns. HF voice sets linked boats, tenders, and the black cats that would find and flare targets. Radar arrived fast. Within a year, most boats carried reliable sets tuned for this knife-fight environment. First contact came with confusion. The night of 13 to 14 October 1942, while Japanese heavy units were shelling Henderson Field, Squadron 3's first boats, PT-60, PT-38, PT-46, PT-48, pushed out from Tulagi into the furnace-orange flashes. Searchlights swept the water. PTs took small-caliber hits and returned fire. Torpedoes were launched at short ranges in the black, with crews judging angles by muzzle flashes and silhouettes. Post-action claims were hopeful. Hits on a cruiser, maybe a sinking. But later analysis found no conclusive enemy losses to PT fire that night. It set a pattern. PTs would be present at the critical hours, complicating Japanese plans, even when the box score didn't sparkle. The boats were learning the terrain, the reefs, and the rhythm. By early December, the PTs were bolder and better guided. On 9th of December 1942 at Kamimbo Bay, a Japanese cruiser submarine, I-3, surfaced to deliver cargo by barge. PT-59 and PT-44 waited. At 07:03, PT-59 fired 2 torpedoes at 400 yards. One struck the stern. I-3 sank quickly. Later, Japanese records attested to roughly 90 dead and 4 survivors, a devastating loss for a submarine being misused as a freighter. That morning's success mattered as signal. Even in daylight haze, PTs could ambush high-value targets near beaches, not just race destroyers in open water. 2 nights later, the Teruzuki intercept wrote the doctrine in fire. PT-37 and PT-40 loitered where destroyers slowed to cover retreating drum carriers. When the Akizuki-class flagship presented her quarter, 2 Mark 8s in the stern killed her steering and lit her stern. Hours later, a magazine cooked off. The ship sank. 9 men died. Hundreds were rescued or swam ashore. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka was wounded and later relieved. Far more consequential than the casualty figure was the message. A single torpedo strike in cramped water could doom a destroyer, and the U.S. was learning where to wait. By mid-1943, the campaign refocused west, New Georgia, Rendova, Kolombangara. With destroyers increasingly at risk near beaches, the Japanese shifted a greater share of supply onto armored barges running tight against the jungle. Barges were expendable, shallow draft, and nasty in a fight. They mounted heavier guns over time. Crews added 25 mm and even 40 mm. Shore batteries sprouted along the routes, timed to PT patrol patterns. Barges hid by day under palm fronds, then moved on the darkest moon. From their new bases at Rendova and Lever Harbor, PTs adapted. They teamed with PBY Black Cats that would illuminate targets with flares on command. On 23 to 24 July, PTs that sank just one barge also scattered the schedule so badly that a Japanese destroyer division failed an urgent transport mission, according to a captured document. The box score looked thin. The operational effect didn't. The raw numbers tell the pressure story. From first barge contact on 24 July through the end of August, Rendova boats encountered 56 barges and 5 small auxiliaries, claiming 8 barges and 1 auxiliary sunk, plus several probables and damaged. Lever Harbor boats, starting 3rd of August, engaged 43 to 44 barges, claiming 2 sunk and many damaged. Not a headline-grabbing total, but barges were armored, close to shore, and backed by shore guns. And interdiction isn't only about sinking, it's about forcing trips to abort or delay. Then came Blackett Strait, 1 to 2 August 1943, the cautionary tale that still defines PT boat risk. 15 boats went out to intercept a small destroyer run. Torpedo salvos were fired at speed and at extreme ranges for the PT's crude fire control. The destroyers slipped through. In the after-action churn, PT-109 idled to reduce wake and listen for contacts. The destroyer Amagiri, running dark at 23 knots, loomed out of the black and cut the 80-footer in two, killing 2 sailors. The survivors, led by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, swam for a tiny island and were rescued days later. Asked later how he became a hero, Kennedy quipped, "It was involuntary. They sank my boat." The lesson for PT doctrine was brutal. Without radar on every boat and disciplined sector control, the risk of being surprised was acute. By late 1943 into 1944, the set piece was different and bigger. Task Group 30.3, under Commodore Alan P. Moran, knitted the Solomons blockade. In May 1944, an average of 24 PTs were on patrol every night in the northern Solomons. That month alone, they claimed 46 barges destroyed, 14 probably destroyed, and 8 damaged, figures that reflected both higher patrol density and tighter intelligence. PTs worked with gun LCIs, PGMs, and mines seeded at river mouths to force barges off the shadows and into water where the boats could rake them. This was industrial interdiction. Boats, tenders, mobjack, Varuna, and a choreography of fueling, maintenance, and crew rotation that let the U.S. keep dozens of small hulls on the line for months. That math of dominance is as stark as it sounds. When you run 24 hulls a night over 30 nights, you're pushing 700 boat nights of presence in a month. Each hour a barge waits under the palms is a ton not delivered. Each forced reroute extends a night run into dawn's air power. PTs didn't need to achieve torpedo glory. Indeed, across 1942 to 45, all U.S. PTs fired only 700 torpedoes in combat. The decisive weapon here was a network, not a warhead. How was the sausage made? Start at the tenders. Jamestown first, then Mobjack and Varuna. Floating bases with workshops, spare Packards, and the people to swap them. A standard rhythm developed. Daily maintenance on plugs and magnetos, bottoms scrubbed as often as conditions allowed to keep that 40-knot dash. Engine changes around 600 hours when spares existed. Scrounged guns bolted on as bargains appeared. the famous Army 37 mm or an extra 20 mm on the bow, then eventually factory-fit 40 mm Bofors. Fuel mattered. 3,000 gallons in tanks meant commanders balanced sprint time versus patrol loiter, because every extra throttle burst shortened time on station. The pipeline back to Elco, Bayonne and Higgins, New Orleans, ensured new boats, spares, and trained crews kept arriving as older hulls wore out. Training began at Melville, Rhode Island, and flowed through Panama staging. Crews learned to run on mufflers, cut wakes, shoot at silhouettes, and fix Packards in the rain. Radar sets, unreliable at first, were fielded fast. Within a year, practically all PTs had reliable radars designed for their size. The message boards on tenders posted after-action tweaks. Don't fire your tube with black powder ejector when the flash will give you away. Close on barges from seaward, so their shore guns shoot into their own friends. Coordinate with PBYs for flares, but kill your wake when aircraft are overhead, so you don't paint a white arrow for enemy float planes. Intelligence linked it all. Coast watchers radioed when destroyers slipped past Bougainville. PBYs orbited to steer PTs onto wake trails. TBS voice nets let a senior officer vector sections with short, secure messages. After July 1943, those cooperative tactics matured. More flares on call, more intelligence on barge staging coves, even mine-laying at river mouths to push barges out of the shadows. The result was a map of no-go gaps that shifted with moon phase and weather, created not by big fleets, but by persistent small craft. The human capital gap surfaced in repetition. Japanese barge crews were tough and often armored behind steel plates, returning fierce fire. But PT crews fired more often, trained their gunners relentlessly, and operated under a routine that let skills compound. A typical Solomon's PT crew might run several patrols a week, practice live fire when ammo allowed, and rotate through maintenance so every man could fix something in a pinch. Senior skippers, Kelly, Taylor, Warfield, Liebenau, wrote their doctrine in briefings, then rewrote it after each night's mess deck critique. The boat's light construction punished mistakes. If you got too close, a barge could hose you at 200 yards. If you used the wrong approach, a shore gun might find your waterline. By late 1943, that veteran skill curve, knowing a reef line by smell, hearing a barge engine under a squall, was a decisive edge. Tactics shifted to refuse the enemy's favorite fight. When destroyers showed with speed and open water, PTs rarely tried to duel in the center of the channel. They looked for pinch points, turn basins, river mouths, narrows where a destroyer slowed to 12-20 knots. Against barges, they used enfilade fire from seaward and smothering volume. 50s, 20s, 37s, and the stern 40 mm. Torpedoes were for ships that had to swing. Gunfire was for everything else. The doctrine hardened. Attack only on your terms, never in the enemy's frame. The boats were small by design. Everything depended on living to fire again tomorrow night. Counter-evidence cuts both ways and must be admitted. In 1942, early 1943, PT torpedo shots against fast destroyers rarely hit. Poor fire control, unreliable detonators, and black powder ejector flashes hurt. Claims after chaotic nights often overstated results. Friendly fire happened. U.S. PTs misidentified targets at least once, with tragic consequences in other theaters. The Solomons were not immune to fog of war errors. Japanese countermeasures, armored barges, shore batteries, float plane harassment, were effective and inflicted losses. PT-117, for example, was destroyed by air attack while moored at Rendova on 1 August 1943. And the most famous PT case, PT-109, was a failure of situational awareness on a dark night, a reminder that patrol persistence came with risk. Roll up the numbers with conservative discipline. Confirmed major ship kills by PTs in the Central Solomons include submarine I-3, 9-deck 1942, and the destroyer Teruzuki, sinking completed after fires and explosion. 1942, barges were the main harvest. In May 1944 alone, Task Group 30.3 boats reported 46 destroyed, 14 duri, satusot sign probable, 8 damaged, with 24 boats on nightly patrol. Credible because claims correlate with higher patrol density and with captured documents noting disrupted schedules. Earlier, July-August 1943 saw dozens of barge contacts. Rendova and Lever Harbor combined 100, with modest confirmed sinkings but significant disruption. Across WW2, PTs fired roughly 700 torpedoes, revealing how often guns, not torpedoes, did the daily killing. Sifted carefully, these numbers describe an interdiction war that strangled supply lines more than it annihilated fleets. Psychology followed the math. Japanese logs and post-war summaries describe barge runs halted or delayed by PT presence. One captured document admits an urgent transport mission, aborted, when a dozen PTs appeared near the assembly point on 23 July 1943. Destroyers grew cautious in confined waters, flagships even more so after Teruzuki. When the enemy believes the shoreline is mined with invisible gunboats, he slows, detours, or waits. Each reaction, a victory for the blockade. For the PT crews, the opposite psychology hardened. Repetitions at night bred a professional calm. Their after-action themes read like checklists. Radar contact. Plot the drift, close from seaward, flare on call. Don't silhouette yourself. Break contact before the float plane arrives. From December 1942 to mid-1943, the operational consequences were dramatic. Drum runs fell off after the Teruzuki loss and the growing nighttime presence. By early 1943, Imperial General Headquarters approved evacuating Guadalcanal, and the famous destroyer runs shifted to cover withdrawals. In the Central Solomons, 1943-44 became a barge war fundamentally shaped by PTs and their partners. Every secure landing, Rendova, Vela La Vela, then Bougainville, tightened the noose and moved PT bases closer to the barge routes. By mid-1944, with New Guinea and the Central Pacific surging, the South Pacific PT force began redeploying west. The blockade had done its job, a quick ethical lens. Most barge targets carried soldiers low on food and high on malaria. Small craft warfare is intimate. Tracer fire sweeps faces at 300 yards. Wrecks wash ashore within hours. The PT mission was to stop supply, men, ammo, rice, which meant those men suffered more the next day. The crews knew it. They also knew that rations and shells denied tonight meant fewer Marines killed tomorrow. We keep that human reality in view. Courage existed on both sides, and the cost fell hardest on those in the boats and on the beaches. Legacy and doctrine radiated outward. Post-war analysts argued over the cost-effectiveness of PTs, but their lessons endured. Small, fast craft, linked by sensors and comms, can deny seas to larger ships in cluttered littorals. In the Solomons, radar on small hulls, persistent logistics via tenders, and an intelligence lattice created a distributed sea denial network before the term existed. Later gunboats, missile craft, and brown water forces carried those ideas forward. Even in an age of satellites, the Solomons remind us endurance at the small edge, fuel hoses, spare engines, practiced crews, wins the long night. So what's the verdict? The Japanese weren't terrified of plywood. They were terrified of uncertainty. Each night, somewhere between a reef and a river mouth, a wake might bloom where the moon said there should be none. A flare might hiss into life over a clutch of barges. A 40-millimeter burst might walk down a gun shield, or a single torpedo might break a flagship's back. Return to that December night. the stern afire, the rudder blown, the admiral carried over the side. In the dark, small boats wrote a large outcome. The Solomons were a contest of systems, and the PT boats were the teeth of a system that owned the night.